Hey internets, time for a quick rant, because I've noticed that a lot of people still, unfortunately, don't really understand the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. And I see a common argument where people will say, oh, it's consequence culture when it's against someone you don't like, and cancel culture when it's against someone you like. And then they'll just kind of sit there thinking they've added something profound to the conversation by pointing out some horrible hypocrisy. When in reality, when you understand what's really going on, you'll realize it's not hypocritical at all. So I'll be explaining why this is a middle ground fallacy, starting with a simple story. Let's say that you have two people living in a small town, John and Bob. And John and Bob, they have a bit of a history together. They don't really get along. They live on the same street and they regularly get into little stupid verbal disagreements. But one day things go a bit too far. John accuses Bob of stealing $10,000 from him, and Bob claims he did no such thing. Heated exchanges then occur, and ultimately the two find themselves in court. Now, let's just say that John manages to win this case, resulting in Bob having to pay back the money he stole and loses his job and reputation in the process, and has to pay an additional fine on top of it for all the time wasted in court. But despite all this happening, Bob still professes his innocence. And, well, after a few months of digging, evidence is unearthed that John in fact staged the whole thing. Video evidence from John's neighbor showed that John had taken the money out of his account and simply buried it in his own backyard, and then framed Bob for the whole theft that never actually occurred. So it was all a bunch of vindictive crap because John didn't like something that Bob said a long time ago. And so then what happens is they find themselves back in court, and pretty clear-cut, objective evidence is then shown that John is in fact the one who's in the wrong, and thus the judge is about to hand down his sentence of a very hefty fine on John for wasting everyone's time and bearing false testimony, scamming the system, and just in general being a lying victim playing jerk. But before the judge can hand down his sentence, the village idiot then stumbles into the courtroom and says, "Hey guys, don't you know that both sides are bad? It was wrong when we had Bob pay a fine, so it's obviously wrong that John is now paying a fine. If we were to force John to pay a fine, that would make us hypocrites." Okay, seriously though, why is it the village idiot is wrong here? Why is this not hypocritical at all? Well, in this story, it's kind of obvious when you just think about it for 2 seconds or so. Because as it turns out, there's a difference between punishing someone who's guilty and punishing someone who's innocent. In fact, the entire point of justice at its core is in order to ensure that this is what happens, at least when it's done properly. The point is to right a wrong. And of course, in cases like the one I just gave, if the courts get it wrong, it is thus entirely reasonable to reverse the decision. Now, of course, the example I just gave is more of a run-of-the-mill, typical property rights issue. Someone was accused of stealing. But of course, not necessarily everything that is bad for society can be called a property crime. There are things like defamation and lying, which, while not necessarily stealing from somebody, is still kind of a jerk thing to do. And so for issues like that, that's where physical removal comes into play. It is entirely reasonable for people to disassociate and shame and criticize those who are caught lying. And for similar reasons as the story I just gave, it is not reasonable to physically remove someone based on information that isn't true. It is this, the difference between truth and nonsense, that the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture is identified. People being dogpiled and criticized online and canceled and whatnot for BS made-up accusations they are either innocent of or are things that shouldn't even be considered wrong by any functioning, rational person, well, that's bad. But when a person actually is guilty of wrongdoing, such as the case of getting caught in a defamation attempt based on BS and demonstrably fallacious arguments, well then, they deserve the consequences coming their way, and that's a good thing. Or to put it very simply, the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture is innocent and guilty. When guilty people get their comeuppance, that is a good thing. When innocent people are attacked and slandered for things that are not real, that is a bad thing. It's actually not a difficult concept to understand at all. And so let's take a step back and go into the context of this little post right here. So you're saying it's okay to do this because the guys we don't like do it? Doesn't that make us no better than them? Well, this kind of misses the point. It's not about liking the person or disliking the person. It's about truth and nonsense. And those of you familiar with my channel, familiar with my previous video, familiar with the recent happenings it was largely about, you might recognize this post as being in response to the whole Vtubergate controversy. Here's a quick TLDR. Anna Valens, a Vice journalist, wrote a hit piece on a VTuber known as Kirsche, and tons of Vice readers ended up dogpiling on her as a result. And of course, there was just one tiny problem with this. The article was complete nonsense. In fact, it's a pretty easy contender for the absolute stupidest hit piece written by a mainstream journalist this year so far. For those who missed it, you can understand it by a good old-fashioned attempt at defamation by fallacy, where it proceeded to commit a Gatling gun of demonstrably invalid arguments. I mean, just in the headline alone, it had loaded questions based on strawman arguments and a guilt by association fallacy. You know, based on the good old-fashioned, you retweeted this person, therefore that means you must agree with every single political position and every single opinion that that person has or ever will hold. And then the article itself was just blatant moralistic fallacies and woke pandering with a shamelessly unveiled attempt to get Kirsche removed from her GamerSup sponsor based on said fallacies. Things like cherry-picking by equating the opinions of your painfully average IQ Reddit midwit who thinks he is a genius because of his sociology degree with the rest of the population, along with, of course, your typical argumentum ad Hitlerum arguments that appeals to said Redditor's emotional and political bias. It then continued with a strawman argument against the Great Replacement theory where recognition of demographic trends somehow makes someone a white supremacist, which is obviously not true and a blatant misrepresentation, again designed to pander to the woke scolds who don't bother to educate themselves on the difference between simply recognizing demographic shifts in data alongside political incentives and believing in insane Elders of Zion tier conspiracy theories. Because, there's actually kind of a big difference between the two. And this idea that simply recognizing demographic shifts counts as a conspiracy theory when that data comes from the United States Census Bureau, that's kind of not a valid argument. And then, of course, it continues on with the usual half-truths of misquoting Kirsche on her views, claiming she generalized the entire trans community, but in reality, Kirsche used the words or and most, which means it was not a generalization at all, along with further moralistic fallacies, further misquoting and misrepresentations of arguments, further misrepresenting data such as cherry-picking police statistics, doubling down, of course, on the whole thing just being an attempt to get Kirsche to lose her sponsors based on fallacious claims, and of course your typical partisan hack argument of this person is right-wing, therefore they are lay-bad. Everything about the hit piece was designed and crafted specifically to rile up the type of people who lack critical thinking skills into attacking a person that Anna doesn't like. The whole thing was a lie. And of course, at first it worked. Kirsche started receiving tons of hate mail and negative reactions and comments as a result of the hit piece. Until, of course, many denizens of the internet, specifically those who do not lack basic critical thinking skills, decided to actually read the hit piece, only to discover that, as I just showed you, the whole thing was a steaming load. And so, naturally, the bulk of the internets ended up instead turning on Anna as people proceeded to rip the article apart, exposing Anna as a liar, giving her negative comments, ultimately resulting in total Foxu victory as Vice took the articles down out of fear of being hit with a defamation lawsuit that they would have a pretty good chance of losing, considering, again, the article was a steaming load. But of course, the real problem here is the people who came in and pulled the whole lay both sides bad, guys. And that is wrong for the same reason and concept as the hypothetical I gave earlier. It is absolutely, completely insane to imply that it is hypocritical to like it when a guilty person receives their comeuppance and not like it when an innocent person gets crapped on for something they didn't actually do. I mean, unless you think that there's just no difference between lying and telling the truth, that's not hypocrisy at all. There's no contradiction when you recognize the differences between guilty and innocent. And it's also further really important to understand that this isn't even really a left or right partisan thing. While it may be the case in this particular example that this happened, that yes, in this context of internet happenings, Kirsche happens to be leaning right-wing and Anna Valens happens to be leaning left-wing, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is truth and false. What matters is liars and people who tell the truth. So it is more of a truth versus bollocks thing. That is the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. When the charges are true, it is consequence culture. When the charges are false, it is cancel culture. That's why this lay both sides bad is a middle ground fallacy. Sure, sometimes there is some truth in the middle between two sides, but it's entirely also possible for one side to be completely full of it, while the other side is completely correct. And plus, in this particular example, there's really just an additional layer of disgust in the cancel culture here between Kirsche and Anna Valens. Because when you consider the context that it's a mainstream corporate journalist of a major publication trying to ruin the livelihood of people who hold significantly less power than they do, and also considering the context that we live in with big tech's largely unnatural monopolies, what Anna Valens did, or really in this case we should say attempted, was just in general a really evil thing to do. When you've got the cathedral and all of its corruption on your side, and you try to abuse that to destroy the life of somebody based again entirely on fallacious allegations, the whole thing just kind of leaves an additional taste of disgust in the mouth. And that is just in general an important thing to understand about physical removal. Physical removal is not really a free pass to be a jerk to the people you don't like, because if you do that stupidly or haphazardly, you may find yourself being the one getting physically removed by society. Rather, physical removal is a way for a free society to remove people who are guilty of things that are bad for that society, that go against the liberty of that society, from the society. It is just a recognition that you need to freely disassociate yourself from liars and con artists, etc., etc. And so not only is it not hypocrisy in any way, physical removal is actually a very objective and very necessary component of sustaining a free society. So yeah, TLDR is just an issue of truth versus false. If you remember that, then you'll understand the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. And so that is all I have to say on the matter. Again, just a quick rant, although for those of you wondering who kind of keep up with my life and whatnot and issues, You may be wondering that because I have posted a quick rant, does that mean that my health is currently doing better? Because as I said, I would kind of cut quick rants out until my health starts getting better. And the answer is not quite yet. I'm still going through problems. Luckily, my doctors have whittled the problem down to being an issue with my spine, and so I've actually started treatment and I actually am feeling a little bit better, but not really quite there yet. And on that note, I do want to greatly thank those who donated to my GoFundMe for my healthcare issues. It actually does help a lot. But yeah, as I'm recovering, I might make a few more quick rants, just letting you know I'm not fully better yet. It's looking like it's probably going to be one of those gradual recovery things. But yeah, again, thank you very much for watching. That is all. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And if you want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, buying some merch, or again, you donate to that GoFundMe. I still have it up for a little bit while longer. But yeah, that is all. Till next time.